Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for joining us at this Communities Up Close webinar on how do neighbourhoods experience migration and report launch. My name's Jackie Broadhead. I'm the Director of the Global Exchange on Migration and Diversity at the University of Oxford, and it's such a pleasure to chair this event today, at which we're going to launch the research report and share findings that look at integration, community cohesion, in the Yorkshire and Humber region, but also I think with findings that are much more widely applicable as well. We are joined by, I think it's about 101 participants, 173 people registered from across the region and beyond. And just to give you a quick outline of this morning's session, we're going to start with an introduction from Pip Tyler from Migration Yorkshire, who commissioned the research. We're then going to have a presentation of the findings from Marley Morris and Lucy Mort from IPPR, reflections from the advisory board and local government and local authority officers who supported the project, and then a Q&A discussion with the panel. Both the chat function and the Q&A function are open, so please put any questions in the Q&A. Just to say that if questions go into the chat, we might not see them. So make sure the questions go in the Q&A. But the chat function will also share the link to the report and other resources as they come up in the discussion. So do keep an eye on that. If you want to tweet this event, the hashtag is communitiesupclose. As I said, it's a real pleasure to be invited to chair this event. My personal interest is on work with local areas about integration and inclusion, and it's often, I think, quite a neglected area. So to see the interest that's been taken by Migration Yorkshire in this is really encouraging. And there's some really exciting findings and recommendations that have been made. I'm particularly interested and impressed by the focus not just on migrant communities, but also on wider, longer standing communities, recognising how important it is to take a whole community approach to integration, and also the neighbourhood focus. With COVID-19 and the rise of mutual aid groups and others, we've seen how important a neighbourhood focus is, and so I think this research couldn't be more timely. And so with that, I will hand over to Pip Tyler, who is the Policy and Research Manager at Migration Yorkshire.
Thanks, Jackie. Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to be quite brief, just to give you a little bit of context about the project, how it came about and what we wanted to achieve. Just in case you haven't heard of us before, Migration Yorkshire is the regional strategic migration partnership operating in Yorkshire and Humber. We work with local authorities and other partners across our region to ensure that Yorkshire and Humber can plan for and respond to migration. Lots of our work on migration tends to be at the whole city or town or local authority level. And that's for good reasons, obvious reasons around where policy sits, where decisions are made, and what kind of statistics we can get. However, we're really conscious that migration is experienced at the individual level, at the local level, perhaps within one or two streets of where you live. And it varies from place to place at that scale. So that can make it really difficult for statutory agencies to plan for migration. So, for example, one area might have a profile of EU migrants in their area, which may have caused some local unrest, whereas another area with the same profile of a migrant community might experience a different response from the local area. And we wanted to look at why different communities might react differently, even if they have similar migrant profiles. So I'll just start with a short story to demonstrate part of the reasoning behind why we began the project. About 3 years ago, a council in our region came to us and said that they were aware that they had a couple of coaches bringing a group of people from Eastern Europe to work in a factory in their local authority. And it was due to arrive quite soon in the next few weeks. They wanted to know from us if there was anything they could do to prepare the local community for that arrival. Was there another council that they could learn from who had had a similar experience? We weren't sure who was best to link them to. We knew places that had had similar experiences, but they were quite different places in themselves regarding the local area, the community makeup, and their history of migration. So we wanted to look in this project about how to link up those communities that would have more similar experiences and similar contexts. We wanted to look at how to build resilience across whole communities and look at positive examples, and how migration can bring certain benefits to areas and encourage balanced perspectives of migration. We wanted to help people understand and respond to the impacts of migration better. So we consulted our local authorities about this idea for a study, and we got lots of encouraging support from them at the stage where we were looking for funding for the project. And the local authorities liked the ideas behind it, and they told us that they wanted to be able to plan services better, they wanted to respond to migration better, understand the context. They wanted a regional benchmark to compare to. They were developing cohesion strategies. They wanted to support migrant communities and reduce negative experiences and perceptions. They also wanted to understand impacts of things like the financial crisis and wanted to be able to use it to support local planning and development decisions. So with all that on board, we were lucky to secure funding from MHCLG for the project, and we began that 2 years ago, and there were 5 stages in the project. The first one, really importantly, was the planning and engagement with our stakeholders and appointing subcontractors to do the qualitative research for us. And we convened an advisory group at that stage to shape the decisions and the design of the project. And the stakeholder group was composed of local authorities in the region. We then looked, in the second stage, we looked at what data was out there about whole communities at the local community level, as small scale as we could find. And then we used that to go on to the third stage, where we identified potential research sites. We came up with a list of neighbourhoods that we felt had experienced significant change from migration, not just in numbers, but in proportion to the local area as well. So we didn't want to necessarily go to the places we knew that had had a lot of migration in the past, but we wanted to look at the places that were just getting on with it quietly and just adapting to relative change in their areas. So that took us on to the fourth stage, which was understanding those impacts of migration in local communities where we had the qualitative research, the fieldwork was undertaken with our colleagues at IPPR. And then now we've moved to our final stage of the project, where we are providing evidence and learning about how to respond to migration at the local level. We've shared a lot of information already at local level with our partners, and we're also preparing a toolkit to share how we went about the project so that others can replicate it if they wish to. And just to conclude, I think if I could go back now to that local authority from 3 years ago that wanted to know what to do when they knew people were arriving imminently, I think now we've got some more insight and some more tools and knowledge to know how to support that local authority and who we could point them to have conversations with to share what they knew already. So I will finish there, and I'm going to hand over to our colleagues at IPPR, Marlene Morris and Lucy Mort, who are going to share with you the really fascinating findings of their qualitative research. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Pip. So we are going to start off with Lucy sharing the slides, the presentation slides. So if you're able to screen share, Lucy, that'd be great. Brilliant, thank you. So I'm just gonna kick off just by talking a little bit about the purpose of the research and the methodology, but I won't dwell on that too long because Pip's already given a very clear and comprehensive summary. Just to start with, really, the the project, and as Pip said, was looking at three key research questions. So just moving on to the first slide. Firstly, we were looking at how do people understand their local area to have changed the result of recent migration, and in particular looking at how broader changes connected to changes that related to migration in particular. Secondly, what factors had helped communities manage those changes, and what factors might have led to some communities experiencing pressures. And finally, what interventions could help communities respond to these changes. And as Pippa said, the methodology was looking at 10 neighbourhoods across Yorkshire and the Humber. For each of the neighbourhoods we looked at, all of which had experienced quite big changes in recent years, and in particular big changes in terms of their recent experiences of migration. For each of those neighbourhoods, we went to speak to 4 focus groups in each neighbourhood of local residents from what we term the host community. Secondly, a focus group with more recent migrants, and thirdly, a series of interviews with stakeholders in the local area. These were local councillors, local services, local community organisations, as well as employers in the area. And just to emphasise, the areas we went to were all pretty small areas. They were identified based as MSOAs, and that's roughly around 3,000 households per area. In total, we spoke to more than 300 people, and broadly we were asking people about how their neighbourhood had changed, their experiences of migration and integration, and what can make their neighbourhood a better place to live. So moving on now to the typology. Now, this was a critical aspect of our research. We developed, as part of the project, a neighbourhood typology that tried to classify the areas in our study on the basis of their experiences of migration. Of course, we couldn't capture every nuance of a neighbourhood in our typology. Inherently, by developing a typology like this, it simplifies the experiences of migration in a neighbourhood. And of course, we often found multiple perspectives on the same issue within an area, or indeed even within the same street. But we do think the typology is useful for helping areas to compare themselves with other areas that are having similar experiences, that have perhaps similar characteristics, and helping to share good practice between local areas. So there were 3 key factors that informed our typology. There was the history of migration to an area, the geography of an area, and the local economy. So all of these were critical in understanding how to identify different areas and their experiences of migration. And through these different factors, we identified 5 key categories in our typology. The next slide shows those 5 categories. And I'm just going to briefly go through each of the 5 to try to summarize those different categories and try to kind of illustrate the different neighborhoods within our typology. Of course, the typology cannot be totally comprehensive. We don't try to cover every single type of area within Yorkshire and Humber, but we try to cover all the areas in our study that have experienced recent increases in migration. So firstly, Cosmopolitan Centres. This is the first category in our typology. So these we characterise as hubs for professional activity, typically in the centre of large and diverse cities. Migration in these areas is long established, and these areas often attract people for work and for study. In these areas, we found that people tended to say that they kept themselves to themselves. Residents were broadly comfortable with increases in migration. And there didn't tend to be much evidence of tensions, very few tensions that we found. But where we did find some concerns, it tended to be about perhaps a lack of community in the area, as well as perhaps some broader issues connected with poverty and inequality in the area. So moving on to the second of our categories is the super diverse districts. So these tended to be in inner city areas with very high levels of diversity, often areas with long histories of migration, quite complex and overlapping histories of people moving for multiple reasons, whether it was for work, for family reasons, for asylum. Many ethnicities, languages, nationalities, faiths in these communities. And often quite vibrant local economies, but also rather high levels of poverty and real challenges around housing, in particular overcrowding. In these areas, we found that residents were broadly very comfortable with migration due to their long histories of migration. There tended to be concerns, broader concerns, not necessarily connected to migration, that tended to centre on issues such as crime and safety, poverty, and some of the housing issues I mentioned. Where there were tensions, they tended to be directed towards more recent groups of migrants that may have come more recently. And that's where some tensions did tend to emerge. But overall, generally, as I said, these neighbourhoods tended to be more comfortable with migration than some of the other neighbourhoods in our study. Thirdly, the third category in our typology, we term diverse suburbs. So these tend to be in suburbs of highly diverse cities. And whilst they're diverse, they are a bit different to the super diverse districts, typically because there are a smaller number of ethnic groups in these areas compared to the more mixed and more super diverse characterization of the last category. And this meant that there could be perhaps clearer social boundaries between distinct communities in these neighbourhoods. And for this reason, while in general residents were comfortable with recent migration due to their histories of migration, we found there was more likely to be pockets of local tensions between communities, including in some instances xenophobia and racism directed towards particular groups. The fourth category in our typology, we term dynamic districts. So these tended to be in cities or large towns, often in or nearby the centre. They could be characterised as areas of transition, experiencing quite significant economic and demographic change over the past few years. They did, in many cases, face particular challenges with poverty and insecure work. There had been a rise in migration in these areas in recent years, and perhaps a bit less familiarity with migration compared with the other areas discussed so far. That meant that although there was quite a big mix of perspectives on migration in these areas, there tended to be somewhat higher levels of scepticism about the changes in their communities. Concerns tended to relate to issues around crime, antisocial behaviour, and also some environmental waste issues, for instance, around fly tipping or littering. And sometimes these could be associated with the recent changes in migration in the communities as well. The fifth of our categories, the final category in our typology, we term tight-knit towns. So these were neighbourhoods in smaller towns with a strong sense of community and a rich industrial heritage. They tended to have quite lower levels of ethnic diversity than the other areas discussed. And they had much more limited histories of migration. But more recently, they had experienced a rise in migration, typically people coming from Central and Eastern Europe and settling nearby for work opportunities in places such as factories and warehouses. So some people in those communities were very comfortable with this change. Others expressed some concerns. And in some cases, we found that people associated these changes in migration with concerns related to antisocial behaviour, and also finding that claiming that there was displacement in the local labour market, so challenges around being able to find work locally. And although tensions rarely bubbled to the surface in these areas, we did find that typically there tended to be little mixing between communities in these neighbourhoods. So that's a brief summary of the five categories. Now I'm going to hand over to Lucy, who will go into the findings in a bit more depth.
Thanks, Marley. Can I just check that people can hear me? Is that okay? Thank you. Okay, so move on. So I'm going to talk through the findings of the report. So as Marley said, we asked communities what their neighbourhood was like, how it had changed, and what their experiences of migration locally were. In the report, we identify 12 key themes from across the research sites. So I won't be going into all of these themes in detail in this presentation, because it would take a little bit longer than we have, but I will give a broad overview of the findings. I just want to reiterate a couple of points for you to keep in mind as we go through. So while this research is of course about neighbourhood change and migration, a lot of the issues that came up in our discussions were not necessarily directly related to migrants and migration, as you'll probably see from this list, but they were related to sort of broader changes locally. But these changes do shape how people perceive migration locally. And second, I just want to be very clear about the fact that there's not one definitive story of the region, of neighbourhoods, and indeed, you know, individuals that we spoke to themselves, you know, held conflicting opinions and views sometimes. So any quote referenced here in this report and in this presentation is just sort of one part of the puzzle. And in the report, we tried to sort of highlight that diversity and yeah, make sure that we sort of reflect that really well. So first of all, we found that the heritage and place of a place and its local identity was really, really important for shaping how people viewed the area and in turn migration to the area. So industrial heritage was really, really key for some of the places that we visited, particularly as you know, Marley's just gone through them, the tight-knit towns and dynamic districts that we visited. So industrial decline was of course, was a strong theme that came through, and a lot of people spoke about that. And there was really, for some people, for quite a lot of people in those areas, there was a sense of loss. And that's loss that's happened over a long period of time. That's not a very recent change, but it's changes that have sort of eroded away over decades. And this narrative around heritage and identity could be used to exclude new migrants coming to the area, and to suggest that they don't belong by some people. However, that was not universal. So as you can see from this quote here, in areas where migrants had sort of historically moved for work and to work in local industries, in this case in the collieries, it could also be sort of a collective narrative that emphasised the contribution of migrants locally. And then in some of the other areas that we went to, those areas that have got a longer history of migration, such as the Cosmopolitan Centre and the super diverse district, migration was more of a fundamental part of how residents talked about the area and its identity. So people would talk about their own family histories of migration, how their grandparents came, you know, 70 years ago, and it was just much more part of the identity of the area. The second thing that I really want to point out, and a key finding, has been how integral economic well-being of people and of neighbourhoods more generally are to how people respond to and view migration locally. So it's obviously linked to industrial decline, as I've just been talking about, but there's this rise in low-paid and precarious work, such as in industries like food manufacturing and warehouse work. And many people that we spoke to from the host and the migrant community spoke about working in low paid jobs, you know, little pay and little security really. And that shaped how people view migration. So particularly, again, we will refer to tight-knit towns and dynamic districts quite a lot because they make up 7 of our areas. But, you know, people may perceive migrants as a kind of cheap labour, as receiving maybe preferential treatment from employers locally, and perhaps as displacing the local workforce. And many were very worried, especially about young people locally in the jobs market, and saw that young people were moving out and maybe not coming back to the area. And that's reflected in sort of statistics about which areas would sort of had an ageing population. And people spoke of facing poverty, either themselves or their family and friends, despite being in work. And again, this was sort of one of those things that fueled hostilities towards new migrants who might be perceived as doing better, unfairly perhaps having more money than they do. And you know, it's that sort of narrative that host communities and migrant communities saw as fueling hostilities locally. And as well with economic wellbeing, austerity and funding cuts to public services and to the voluntary sector is something that came out loud and clear. And it was discussed a lot by the host community and especially by stakeholders working across the region. So diminishing services, you know, be it in the NHS, in schools, you know, broadly in public services, tended to affect people's views of migration locally, as they perceived resources was too stretched to cope with, you know, a growing population. In this quote, we see how one participant who was volunteering in their local community spoke about wanting actually to do more to attract new migrants living in the area, but felt that they couldn't do very much because they were just sort of struggling or managing to keep afloat due to funding challenges. And so in times of austerity, it was kind of seen that maybe integration was a bit of a luxury that couldn't be afforded, but most people spoke about how they wish they could do more, but it was rather a lack of resources that meant that they couldn't. And now I'm going to come on to talk about some of those broader changes. So I'm sort of grouping some issues together here. So broader changes related to housing, to declining high streets and town centres, the neighbourhood environment and crime and safety, and how these shape people's perceptions of migration locally. So, you know, people spoke about the closure of markets, of rows of boarded up shops and closed banks, etc., particularly again in the tight-knit towns and dynamic districts. But at the same time, people saw, you know, an increase in foreign-owned shops and businesses. And while some saw this, you know, as great, as boosting the local economy, others were a bit more sceptical, as you can see from this quote. And how people spoke about shops that stocked foreign goods or which were foreign-owned became something of a litmus test, really, for how people viewed migration more broadly. So, you know, some people might, I've got another quote here that's not on the screen, but someone talks about how they really loved having sort of Polish shops in the area because they felt they were unlikely ever to go to Poland. So it was nice that they could sample the foods of the country. Littering and fly tipping were key concerns highlighted by host and migrant communities that we spoke to. And this obviously really shaped how people viewed their area. Particularly in super diverse districts, diverse suburbs and dynamic districts. And this could cause community tensions. Some attributed environmental issues and challenges to new migrant populations. And stakeholders also saw this as a key site of tension locally. And it was really clear that the appearance of neighbourhood is really important for how residents viewed the area and sort of for us as a source of civic pride. It was often the place that people sort of directed their sort of volunteering attentions and that sort of thing. And a big concern across the region except in a couple of the tight-knit towns that we went to, were issues around crime and perceptions of safety. So a lot of people spoke about feeling more unsafe in their local area. Some of the women that we spoke to particularly spoke about maybe taking different routes to avoid particular areas of the town or the city. And there was a lot of discussion about what was real and what was perception, and there were significant differences, I'd say, between residents and stakeholders. And there was a disconnect maybe between people's perceptions and sort of actual crime statistics. Crime was often associated as well with young people and or people from minority, ethnic and migrant backgrounds. So you can see how crime and migration to the local area become linked. An increase in crime could be perceived as a result of increased migration to the area. And this was really reinforced by social media and more broadly in the media. I think I'll probably have to go quite quickly through these. Views on migration and integration. So people spoke a lot, of course, about how the areas that they lived in have become more diverse. This might be recognisable through people speaking more languages and hearing diversity in the streets. Already diverse areas were seen to have become much busier and neighbours more transient. And when people spoke about migration in the region broadly, people were talking about new migration as related to Eastern European migrants, more so than any other group. So there was relatively little discussion about asylum seekers and refugees, though none at all. And in the diverse suburbs, dynamic districts, tight-knit towns, there were greater concerns about migration generally. And this concern about migration could also sort of intertwine with and link with broader concerns and hostilities towards ethnic minority populations, and particularly to Muslim communities in some areas. I'd say there was broadly little understanding of different rights and statuses of migrants, and that often lent itself to conversations about stricter immigration policies. But on the flip side, lots of people spoke about migration as bringing opportunities to the local area, and people often held mixed views, as you can see from this quote. And there were a wide range of views about how different groups get along with one another. People spoke a lot about keeping themselves to themselves, or they keep themselves to themselves. In some areas that was a concern, especially in tight-knit towns where people want to be sort of neighbourly. In Cosmopolitan Centre, it didn't really matter that much that people kept themselves to themselves. People spoke about English, of course, as a shared concern and as a barrier to integration, but that was a priority for migrants and host community alike, to have greater access to English classes. Another key barrier to integration that we heard of was around having time, energy, money to get involved in community events. But generally, there was a desire from both sides, I'd say host and migrant communities, for greater opportunities to meet for a host of reasons that I go into in the report. And this quote here, I like it. It's someone who actually had broadly quite anti-immigration views, but in the abstract, but when they sort of spoke about their own experiences in their neighbourhood, they had quite positive relationships with a diverse range of people. And just moving on to migrant experiences, we spoke to around up to 50 migrants. So from EU backgrounds, asylum seekers and refugees, and international students. And experiences and concerns are not dissimilar, but they're compounded by additional factors. So generally people were positive, but for EU migrants especially, there was concerns about Brexit, and they felt that they'd had sort of increased hostility, or they feared increased hostility with Brexit. And for asylum seekers, their experiences of the neighbourhood were vastly shaped by their restrictions related to sort of dispersal, the time it takes to receive their refugee status, and they're not being allowed to work. It really shaped how they moved about the neighbourhood, who they could meet, and their well-being more generally. So coming on to recommendations. So the report highlights a number of recommendations for policy and practice at the neighbourhood, at the regional and at the national level. So at the local, regional level, we sort of suggest that we need to invest more in English language support, coordinating provision locally and facilitating sort of partnership working between providers, detecting where there may be gaps and where people might not know about accessing ESOL. We suggest that we need to actively engage employers on integration. Where local employers are recruiting migrant workers, local authorities could engage with them and with trade unions and recognise the role that they maybe have in the community in bridging host and migrant communities. We suggest that there should be greater opportunities for facilitating social contact, which will be especially important sort of as we move more out of the pandemic mode. And something that came through really strong as well was around inclusive decision making. People wanted to be involved more in local community decisions. And finally, we suggest that tensions and discrimination need to be taken very seriously, and a partnership approach be taken to calming tensions, tackling xenophobia and hate crime, and challenging fake news and rumours and misconceptions. And finally, for national government, we suggest a number of things. So strengthen local economies and invest in social infrastructure, as part of the levelling up agenda. We suggest that we should introduce reforms to the labour market to ensure that there is decent work for all. We suggest that there should be greater investment in English language support. And finally, we would like to see an immigration system that aids integration and settlement rather than hinders it. And that's everything from me.
Thanks so much, Lucy and Marley. We're now going to move on to some reflections from local authorities, from members of the advisory group that supported the project. So we're first going to hear from Jane Wise, who's a member of the advisory group, as well as housing and migration team leader at Barnsley Council. And then Vicky Ledwidge, who is the Integration and Partnerships Officer at Migration Yorkshire and was also the local authority liaison for this project. Please do keep adding your questions to the Q&A section for the discussion after that.
Thank you. This is Jane. Can everybody see and hear me? Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm Jane from Barnsley, and I would like to talk about my experience of this project and how fortunate I feel personally and on behalf of the local authority that I'm employed by. Personally, being a very nosy person, to be totally honest, a very nosy person, I am fascinated by how people live, how people come together, how they interact, just generally how people cope when they are faced with challenges and changes to their lives and their families' lives. So I feel extremely fortunate to have been included on the advisory group initially, and to be involved in how the project was set up and how it would work in the different areas that were eventually chosen, and to be part and parcel of the practical work, such as the questionnaires that were used to talk to people in the focus groups and individually. So really pleased about that. We were very fortunate again to be chosen as a site, and I really welcome that, as did my senior leaders. This is something, to my knowledge, that we have not been able to do before here. The resources are very scarce for this sort of work, rightly or wrongly. Plus, my feeling is that the residents are feel more comfortable talking to independent people rather than talking to us as council officers, that they're going to be more open and honest, rather than perhaps try and think about what we might want to hear. So terrific work. I've been really heartened. I find it so interesting how sites were chosen, you know, the quantitative data as well as the qualitative, which is the key, obviously. And I have to say, whether we were chosen or not, I would have been more than happy to have continued as part of the advisory group and to be involved in the project overall, whether or not it was personal to me. From the findings of the project, from my point of view, and this is so timely because I go from this meeting to one of our management team to talk to the some of the directors and the exec director about the findings of the project. So brilliant timing. But for me, the absolute key, what has come out of this, is that this is from our residents' own mouths. It is not me saying as a council officer what I think is happening and what I think people are feeling and what I think people need. This is from the residents' own mouths. This is their own thoughts and feelings, and that is so valuable. We can't, as an organisation, provide for our communities unless we know the communities, unless we know what they are experiencing and what challenges and barriers they are facing, and help people to come together. So that has been absolutely key for me, the main benefit. And I would like to use this, and I am backed up by some of my managers to use this to work now on a local plan to bring about better cohesion and integration within our communities across the board. Absolutely everybody, regardless of background, regardless of anything, that we are a better community, that we'll work together much better. We can't do this alone. We absolutely can't, as a local authority, as a department within a local authority. No organisation can do this alone. And this, for me, gives me the evidence to be able to take to the decision makers within our organisations to make the case very well for putting something together and implementing it as soon as we possibly can. And again, back to the personal nosy stuff, this gives me so much material about how people tick, how they work, and which I find other people's lives endlessly fascinating. So yeah, Vicky, I don't know what you want to add to that.
That's great, Jane. Thank you very much. So my role within this project was to act as the liaison between the project team and the local authorities. So I've been involved right from the start. And I think it's fair to say that some of the research sites were a little bit nervous about starting this research, because when an independent organisation comes in, you never really know what you're going to find. I think people who are interviewed by somebody they don't know can sometimes be a little bit more open about their true feelings. But we found as we've gone on that the findings have actually been very well received by the local authorities, for many of the reasons that Jane's already said. So through disseminating the reports to the groups, what we found really that there was an overriding sense that the work has confirmed either what was already known through the local authorities' own research, or that they thought they knew but didn't have any evidence to back it up. There were some surprises along the way, I think it's fair to say that, particularly around the strength of feeling. Some of the quotes that are in the reports can be quite stark and hard to read, but there are some huge positives that went alongside the negative quotes, and I think the report's very well balanced. There was also a few surprises in the issues and the range of issues that came up, and particularly those that cross-cut demographics. So not necessarily targeted at particular migrant groups, but things around austerity and the lack of the issues that language barriers create and the like, I think can cross-cut all sections of society. So I think the reports have been very, very useful. They haven't been tokenistic. I think a couple of the local authorities have been very, very clear that these are living, breathing documents that they are going to use going forward. Having an independent organisation come in that's got no institutional or organisational memory to look at things with fresh eyes has been very, very useful. A couple of the local authorities, including Barnsley, are using this to drive their new community cohesion plans going forward, which is very exciting. One in particular also wants to use it to work with their local voluntary sector organisations as evidence for funding bids, which I think is another huge benefit to the work that IPPR have done. So, you know, we're still plodding through them. There are still some conversations to be had. But the feeling overall is a living, breathing piece of research that's not tokenistic at all. And the toolkit is going to be very useful as people either go back into the same communities to repeat the research or look at going into new areas. And hopefully we can carry on this conversation in the next Zoom call at 12. But I'll hand back to Jackie now for the Q&A.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks to everybody for submitting their questions. Just a reminder that if there are questions that we don't get to, there is the discussion at 12 where there'll be much more of a chance for a discussion, as is suggested. Also, we're delighted to be joined for this Q&A part of the event by Zara Niazi, who is the programme lead for the Stronger Communities Together programme at Bradford Council. So, a number of different questions that have come up in the chat. I wanted to start with a number of methodological questions, and I'm going to group some of them together for Marley and Pip, probably. There was a question about the sample sizes that had been used and the selection of neighbourhoods. And also there was a question about the definition of neighbourhoods. So a group of questions essentially about some of the methodological approaches that have been taken. So I don't know if Marley or Pip want to come in on those questions.
Do you want me to come in, Pip, or
Yeah, you go for it and then I'll supplement.
Sure. So yes, I've picked up a few of these questions. So I think in terms of our definition of a neighbourhood, which I think was one of the questions, as I said, we identified neighbourhood really based on MSOA, which is around 3,000 households. So it's quite a broad category. We wanted to go further in depth if possible, but methodologically very challenging to do. So we thought this was a suitable size of neighbourhood, which was broad enough to make the research feasible, but also specific enough in order to identify specific trends that were happening at a very local level. In terms of the questions around definition of diversity, so generally speaking, I think in the report, certainly when there are any figures used, we talk about ethnic diversity really in terms of drawing a distinction between white British and all other ethnic groups. So that's following the definition that the government used as part of the race disparity audit. So that's when we talk about the proportion of ethnic minority people within a community, we're defining it as everyone who doesn't fall into that white British category. Of course, it's a very contested area, and there's lots of questions about definitions of ethnicity, and there's a lot more nuance to that. We try to capture that in the findings section of the report, where we talk a lot more about kind of different communities' experiences of different types of diversity. But just in terms of the figures, that's how we've defined it, just because we had to make some kind of decision. In terms of the questions around how we've identified different neighbourhoods and sort of the selection of the typology. So first of all, in terms of identifying the neighbourhoods, we used information based on national insurance numbers and on the census to identify the 10 neighbourhoods that had experienced significant recent change in migration. That was the best data that we had available that was up that MSOA level. And then the typology, what we tried to do there is look at the 10 neighbourhoods and identify where we thought there were parallels between neighbourhoods and where we thought there were important distinctions based on the quantitative data that we had, but also based on the experiences of the neighbourhood and the conversations that we'd had in each neighbourhood. And so we tried to categorise on that basis. That did mean that there were more neighbourhoods that were in the categories of the dynamic districts and the tight-knit towns in some of the other neighbourhoods. But we felt that reflected the conversations that we'd had and the experiences of those neighbourhoods. We also made sure that we referred to other typologies that had been used in other studies, and so we tried to link in some of the other typologies that had been developed, so that it reflected some of the broader literature on this topic. And so I think hopefully the typology we've developed, it reflects broadly some of the other research that's been taken at the neighbourhood and local level on integration and migration, and hopefully is applicable in those other contexts as well.
I'll just add to some of what Marley said in terms of the questions. Somebody asked about sample sizes. So for each research site, approximately, I think there were around 25 local residents were in a series of focus groups and a set of about 10 interviews with key stakeholders in each neighbourhood as well. So if you add all that up across the 10 sites, it comes to over 300 individuals. But it was a qualitative research project, so our emphasis was on smaller numbers and really good quality conversations. Also on the selection process that Marley's described, it was quite a long, thorough process. We ranked every neighbourhood in the region according to the census and the NINO data that we had for the ones that had changed the most. So we developed some variables around that and looked at the top ones across the whole region. And then we also looked at contextual factors, so socioeconomic data, as well, and deprivation data, so that we were choosing a good mix across the sites. And then once we'd looked at all the quantitative data, we also spoke to the local authorities, particularly in the advisory group, but in the potential research sites, to see if those were places that they were interested in us going to. And some of the local authorities said, oh, we feel like we know a lot about that neighbourhood, or we don't really want you to go to that neighbourhood because we're doing a lot of work in it, or and we take on board those considerations too, so that that affected the final decision as well. And yes, the last thing I was just going to say about when somebody was asking about our definition of migrant and BAME groups, while we might have stuck more strictly to those definitions that Marley explained in the selection process, when we talked to local communities, we were quite loose with it and just asked them about their experience of change and let them define it in terms of their experience. And I think largely people tended to talk about really recent migration, EU migration in the last 5-10 years, but we wanted to leave it so that they could define what had affected them in their place. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Pip. Yes, and in my research, we've used newcomer and longer standing community, with longer standing community including longer standing BME communities. And it's a lot harder when you're trying to do quantitative research when that data doesn't exist, but it's an important question. I wanted to bring in Jane and Zara. We have a question here about the place of integration as a policy area, and it's often something that doesn't get as much prioritisation, partly because of lack of statutory duties in this area, partly because of funding. So one of the questions is about how can we boost integration as a policy area, and how do you see the findings of this report perhaps supporting that in your respective local authorities? Zara, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, So Bradford Council is one of 5 integration areas, so I suppose we're in a really quite a good position to kind of really respond to this question. We, as a response to the Integration Strategy Green Paper that was written in March 2018, we developed our own delivery plan and strategy around that year. And so we're actually into 1 year into our programme. So it's roughly around about a £2.7 million programme, which has around about 40 projects, quite heavily in terms of research and evaluation, because obviously we want to build a strong evidence base. I think obviously as time has gone on, I think with coronavirus taking a lot more kind of centre stage now, it's become a little bit more difficult to try to get our agenda back. And also with post-Brexit, there's been obviously, I suppose, ministry changes, and there's been a slight different focus in government. The 5 areas are, I mean, some of us are in completely different stages, I guess, but in terms of Bradford, you know, there's a huge amount of volume of work that we've done in terms of talking to communities, developing our projects, and obviously during this time we are thinking about how we adapt a lot of our sort of delivery mechanisms, moving our engagement, for instance, online. There is so much we can do at a local level when it comes to integration, just because there are government policies that that actually respond in a way that actually counteracts those kind of positive steps and changes you want to make. For example, like the hostile environment, the immigration sort of policies that are coming out now that actually makes integration a lot more difficult. At a local level, of course, there are lots of things that we have done to really boost integration as much as possible. Work around, for example, our ESOL. So we've set up a single point of contact, working on learning English, which is about really mapping English language regionally and making it a lot more easier for people who want to learn English. And then there's some elements about how we're also trialing out some new ways of learning English online using existing models, like using peer volunteers. So we're kind of really adapting a lot of that. There's also something we've just launched called Welcome to Bradford, which is looking at new migrants coming into the city. And we've got a whole bank of ambassadors that we're using, which is local people developing and harnessing the sort of community spirit that's come through COVID. All those volunteers, people who've willingly, informally or formally given their time up for to support communities in their own areas or across the district, and actually using them as a platform to really be the voices of communities and to engage with communities further. And I think more than anything, what we're realising is that through the consultation that we did previously and the work that obviously Community Up Close have done, is allowed us to kind of really look at what's been changing within each of the areas. So for example, what we've seen is a lot of our Eastern European communities have settled in, for instance, within exactly where majority of our Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups are. And so what we're seeing is a lot of our inner city Bradford areas are becoming a lot more diverse as a result. So how we have that social connection is becoming more and more important, but obviously the challenges we face is right now, because of COVID, makes it a lot more difficult. So there's, lots of conversations that we're currently still having with government, but I think that the evidence base that we can bring and some of the research we're bringing in through our work and projects like this will really help us to kind of build the case, I guess, that integration should and continues to stay on the agenda.
Thanks so much, Zara. And Jane?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very good question. Often, as I've pointed out, because it's not a stat duty, if there is any improved, enhanced integration, it's often as a byproduct rather than the absolute focus. Now, for me, it has to be local level involvement, as has already been pointed out, and it has to come from us. I see my responsibility now, as a result of this project and other projects going on, to advise my senior managers that this is what's needed. We need something absolutely that focuses very much on integration and cohesion, on integration and cohesion. I also think we need to stop talking and start doing, which is why this is a very useful platform, this particular project, to move things along for us. And absolutely, I agree with that COVID is making things very much more difficult, but also it's an opportunity. We are looking at recovery planning, as all local authorities, most organisations are, and we have seen that, you know, as across the UK, that gaps have widened between those who are perhaps disengaged or disenfranchised in our societies. And we are looking at how we can rebuild those societies. So for me, the dreadful pandemic is an opportunity as well to work the integration agenda into how we rebuild our communities and how we rebuild that resilience particularly. And we do need to make it a focus. I look on in awe at you know, at areas such as Bradford, where they're one of the integrated towns and cities, part of that movement, and we can learn so much. One of the great things about this project and other initiatives that are taking place is that we learn first of all that we are not alone in the issues perhaps that we face and the challenges that we face, and we can learn from each other, and we really need to do that. We cannot build an integration locally until we integrate better as organisations together to do this as a collective. We cannot do it alone.
Thanks so much, Jane and Zara. I think building on some of the points that were raised and two groups of questions that came up in the Q&A, Lucy, there are a number of questions about how the recommendations link to the findings. So specifically, what did you find that supported your recommendations about ESOL provision? And in particular around funding. We've seen the devolution of adult skills funding that's kind of been lost with COVID and everything that's been happening, but huge changes actually that are happening to the adult education and to ESOL provision, and it's quite unclear how that's going to work out. But what did you find, and how did that kind of read across to your recommendation? And secondly, there were lots of questions related to community contact and engagement, and you know, where you're saying that in your typology that works in different ways in different places. What does that mean then for designing programs of community contact? I like in the report it talks about not doing it in kind of too cringe, I'm paraphrasing, but too cringeworthy or obvious a way, and how actually can you facilitate that? And obviously especially in this time of the pandemic, and where we're seeing people being distantly socializing rather than social distancing. So Lucy, over to you.
Thanks, Jackie. On ESOL, I think the question was around so what were the kind of different attitudes and perspectives that people have on about English. So there was a really wide range of views, I'd say, on attitudes towards speaking English and ESOL. So speaking English and the importance of that for host and for migrant communities came up in every group that we spoke to. So it was really key when people spoke about getting to know either new migrant communities or getting to know the host community. People spoke about the sort of importance of having a shared language. But I would say that, of course, it depended on the sort of perspective of people, how they felt about migration more broadly as to what they thought the solution was. So our recommendations are not necessarily directly picked from all of the views of people that live in the region. So for some people, they were very sort of understanding of the process of learning English, and wanted more sort of supportive solutions. So greater access. Some people that we spoke to in host communities worked in adult education themselves and knew of the difficulties of funding, and of course stakeholders that we spoke to working in the sector spoke about the difficulties of funding. and the sort of reduction of classes. So there was a lot of people that were sort of referencing that and talking about the need for greater funding. There were areas such as one of the tight-knit towns that we went to, and they have a model where there's sort of community comes together and makes decisions about funding around issues that sort of impact on the local neighbourhood. One of those areas had funded an ESOL programme in the local library in this quite small town to support new migrant communities. And a lot of that is sort of, those kind of examples are related to, you know, whether the right person's in the right place at the right time. So that felt like it wasn't very, you know, they could be there 1 minute and gone the next. So I think people want more certainty about ESOL provision. On the other hand, and the other thing that was quite nice in some discussions that we had, people sort of, again, in this sort of more supportive understanding frame, was about it being a two-way process, and, you know, why are we learning maybe French and Spanish at school when we could be learning Polish and things like that, and really getting to know one another, it being a bit more of a two-way process. And that usually sparked interesting conversation. And then I'd say at the other end of the scale, there were people who were less, expressed less understanding and sort of desired a more punitive response to people that don't speak English, and, you know, people that spoke about it needing to be a fundamental part of the immigration system, and when people spoke about not allowing people into the country if they didn't speak English and things like that. So there was some support for those, but I would say that generally people sort of veered towards they're wanting there to be opportunities to learn English in the local area. So that's why we've come to the, you know, that conclusion in our recommendations about a need for greater funding for ESOL. And of course, I know it's a huge area of work, and a hugely challenging area of work, and we couldn't go into all of that in the report, but hopefully it sort of supports that other work that's going on around advocating for greater ESOL resources. I know Migration Yorkshire are going to be having something come out on that soon as well, so watch the space for that. On contact and engagement, it's a tricky one. So people, you know, so we sort of suggest that we don't just want to suggest that people do sort of a one-off festival every year and that be sufficient for facilitating social contact. But often that is the frame that people sort of can latch onto, and it's easily understandable, and you know, it's nice and it's fun, and, you know, people like to go to those sorts of events. But there was also an understanding, especially speaking to stakeholders, but also, you know, speaking to migrant communities and some people that are sort of a bit closer to migrant communities themselves, that it needed to be more sustained, and there needed to be spaces where people could come together. And people spoke about, you know, the loss of community centres and civic space that enabled that sort of thing to happen. So there was, a desire for more sustained contact, but also recognition of the struggles maybe around that, and which is why it's great to have local authorities on the line that can that can think about those sorts of things, and how you support contact without forcing it down. You know, forcing it on people that maybe don't want it. Some people are quite happy to keep themselves to themselves. I might come back to that one in the next session if there's anything else that I think of, but is that okay?
Great, thanks so much. We're rapidly approaching the end of the session, so I just wanted to finish up with a question to Pip and Vicky, just around, there was a question about Migration Yorkshire's role in facilitating some of this, and how we're going to use and take forward some of the findings, both in terms of peer learning and sharing with local authorities, but also in terms of taking this agenda forward. So that seemed to me like a good place to wrap up this session.
Great, I'll go first and then hand on to Pip. So we can carry on this conversation in the next session at 12, but there's still some work to do on this project. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be holding some peer learning sessions for the research sites. So we've taken the 10 major themes that have come out of the research, and we're hosting conversations with people who are, like I said, in the research sites, who can then come into that space and talk to each other. Jane and Zara have both made the point that, you know, we need to learn from each other. A big part of the work is to facilitate those conversations and those peer-to-peer contacts. We feel, sitting over the project, that some of the local authorities have got some very good solutions to problems that exist elsewhere, so we're hoping to join some of the dots with that. Pip, do you want to add anything?
Thanks, Vicky. Just the last thing that I would add is that we, particularly on the question of social interaction, we're conscious that this piece of work can't give us every answer at the moment. And so one of the things that we've done, because we felt like this was a really significant aspect of what happened in the research, what people wanted to talk about, and that local communities wanted that too, that they wanted opportunities to engage and meet people and develop those relationships. So because we feel like that's quite a priority, we have applied for funding to build on this project and particularly look at that question in more detail, rather than just kind of repeating what we've already done, but to really hone in on that. So that's our hope, that that we might be able to follow that up next year. We're just waiting for the outcome of that application at the moment, but if we are unable to do that, then we'll look at other ways perhaps of exploring that question too.
Thanks so much, Pip. Thanks to all of the panellists and to all of the participants for joining. A quick reminder, the report is available both in the chat and also on the Migration Yorkshire website. There's an evaluation as well that I think will either be available in the chat or again on the website. And finally, there's this follow-up discussion in 15 minutes time. Stretch your legs and then do join again to further discuss. Thanks very much.